You've probably heard those theories, right? About shadowy groups buying up the entire world. But what if the story isn't some big secret? What if it's all just out there, sitting in public records and financial filings? Today, we're going to break down the publicly available evidence behind one of the most controversial phrases of our time. Right here, this is the phrase that kicked this whole thing off. It was a prediction for the year 2030, and it was promoted by the World Economic Forum. It went absolutely viral. A lot of people dismissed it, and then it kind of faded away. But what if it wasn't just some bizarre fantasy? What if it was actually describing a huge economic shift that's already happening? Well, that's the mystery we're digging into today.
So that's really the big question here, isn't it? Is this whole own-nothing future just some internet paranoia, or is there actual tangible evidence in the public record that points in this direction? We're not going to speculate here. We're just going to follow the data, look at the documents, see the public statements, and find out where it all leads. Okay, so to really get our heads around this story, we have to start with the scale of it all. Because the numbers we're about to talk about are, well, they're almost impossible to comprehend. And we're going to focus on one company that sits right at the heart of this story, BlackRock.
Here's the number. By 2025, BlackRock had over $14 trillion in assets under management. Just let that number sink in for a second. $14 trillion. I mean, it's a number so massive it's practically meaningless without some context. So here's that context. That one single company controls more wealth than the entire yearly economic output of Japan, more than Germany, more than the United Kingdom. In fact, its portfolio is bigger than the GDP of every single country on Earth except for the two superpowers, the United States and China. And just look at this chart. It really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? BlackRock's assets under management just dwarf the combined economies of several of the world's most powerful nations. We're not just talking about a big company here. This is a financial force on a global geopolitical level.
And sitting at the very top of this financial empire is one man, Larry Fink. He's the founder, he's the CEO. But here's where it gets really interesting. In August 2025, Fink was named the interim co-chair of, you guessed it, the World Economic Forum, the same organization that pushed that "you will own nothing" phrase. So you have a man who manages $14 trillion, who once said in an interview, "You have to force behaviors," now helping lead the very group that promoted that specific vision for the future.
Now, you don't manage that kind of money by just, guessing. It's all guided by this unbelievably powerful technological brain, an AI system that most people have never even heard of. It's called Aladdin, and it is the technological heart and soul of BlackRock. The whole thing was born after Larry Fink took a $100 million trading loss early in his career. He apparently became obsessed with building a system that could see risks that no human possibly could, and Aladdin was the result.
So what does this thing actually do? Well, every single day, thousands of computers in a data center in Washington state are just hoovering up a mind-boggling amount of information. Market data, political news, weather patterns, even things like satellite images of parking lots at shopping malls. Then it runs over 5,000 disaster simulations. What if interest rates shoot up? What if a war breaks out in the Middle East? All of it is designed to spot and manage risk across the entire global economy.
And this is where the number gets even crazier. See, Aladdin doesn't just guide BlackRock's own $14 trillion. Hundreds of other massive institutions, we're talking pension funds, insurance companies, even central banks, they all license the software to manage their money. All told, the total value of assets whose decisions are guided by Aladdin is over $21 trillion.
Let that sink in for a second. One single piece of software from one company is influencing how roughly 10% of all the world's financial assets are managed. Some critics call this a monoculture of risk. I mean, it makes sense, right? When everybody is using the same AI brain to see the world, they all start to react in the exact same way, which could actually amplify a crisis instead of stopping one.
So you've got this incredible amount of capital and this powerful AI technology, and that combination has led to something else, a concentration of ownership in the companies that shape our everyday lives that is totally unprecedented.
When you put your money into a simple index fund, where does that money actually go? Well, a huge chunk of it flows into these giant asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Together, people call them the Big Three. And as you can see from this chart, they are now the single largest shareholder in about 90% of America's 500 biggest companies. That is a very, very small group of firms with a dominant stake in, well, almost everything.
And we're not talking about some obscure industrial companies you've never heard of. We are talking about the brands that you interact with every single day. The phone in your hand, the software on your computer, the package that shows up on your doorstep, the gas you put in your car. In pretty much every case, one of the big three is the most significant shareholder.
Now, this whole situation creates something economists call common ownership. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it. If you are the biggest shareholder in both United Airlines and in Delta, do you really want them to get into some brutal price war that's just going to destroy profits for both? Well, academic studies suggest this exact thing may be leading to higher airfares and way less competition in all sorts of industries, from banking to pharmaceuticals.
Okay, so the influence doesn't just stop with the private sector. The source material we're looking at points to this really, really close relationship between BlackRock and the U.S. government, one that critics say is, well, deeply troubling, especially when a crisis hits. Just look at this timeline. It's pretty wild. It starts back in 2008 when the Federal Reserve hires BlackRock on no-bid contracts to clean up the absolute mess from the financial crash. Fast forward to August 2019, a team of former central bankers who now work for BlackRock publishes a paper that outlines this radical new bailout plan called Going Direct. Just 7 months later, the market crashes. And who does the Fed hire to run the bailout? BlackRock. They were hired to put into action the very bailout plan that they themselves designed.
So we've covered the money, the AI, the corporate ownership, the government ties, but there's one last piece to this puzzle. And it's about moving from owning financial assets on a computer screen to owning the actual physical infrastructure of our world.
And this is a really big deal, a huge shift in strategy. BlackRock and firms just like it are now some of the biggest owners of things you and I can't just choose to avoid. We're talking about airports like Gatwick in London, major toll roads, shipping ports, even the massive data centers that power the internet and the whole coming AI revolution.
All right, so let's try to bring this all together. When you combine that level of financial power, the technological surveillance, the corporate control, the government access, and now the ownership of essential physical stuff, what kind of economy do you actually get? Well, the argument is that you get this: a fundamental shift away from an economy built on widespread ownership towards one that's based on renting and subscriptions. You don't buy the software anymore, you subscribe to it. You don't own the car, you lease it. And for more and more people, you definitely don't own the house, you pay rent to a massive corporation. And every single month, wealth flows from the people using the service to the people who own it. And here's the key takeaway from the source material. The claim isn't that this is some secret plot cooked up in a dark, smoke-filled room. The argument is that this is something way more powerful. It's a system with a very clear set of incentives that is producing a predictable outcome. This concentration of wealth, this shift to a rental economy, it isn't an accident. It's the logical result of how the whole system is designed.
And that leaves us all with one final and pretty vital question. This isn't about good guys or bad guys. It's about the structure and the incentives of the system itself. So, what happens to a society when the financial incentives of the tiny group that owns the system start to diverge completely from the interests of the vast majority of people who just live inside it? That's the experiment we're all living through right now.